Oh. Ariyo, and greetings from Niagara Falls. Right before joining all of you, I was in our older son's room, Vyasa, and I was reading to him a book called The Rabbit Listened. Has anyone read this book before? The Rabbit Listened? Okay, some of you have. It's about this young boy who builds this awesome tower out of wooden blocks. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this flock of crows, I'm not really sure what that designation is called, but this flock of crows comes in, wrecks this tower. And this boy is deeply upset by that. And so many other animals try to come and comfort him. Like an elephant that says, let's rebuild this. And a bear that says, let's just shout. And a snake that says, let's break other people's towers. And then finally, there's a rabbit that comes. And this rabbit just sits beside this young boy and doesn't say anything. And when this boy feels this rabbit, the warmth, the sensitivity, the boy starts to speak to the rabbit about how he's feeling right now. The frustration, the sadness. And eventually, this boy lets go of all of that negativity and starts to rebuild this tower. As I was reading this and knowing I was going to rush down to come and introduce our workshop this evening, this reminded me a lot of reminds me a lot of our wellness mentorship program. We began this program in January, and one of the focal points of this program is active listening. We live in a very, very, very fast time. You probably already know this, but you may not realize this, but August is over. The days are becoming darker. If you look around at people who have daylight right now, it's dark right now. Just a month ago, it wasn't, correct? You would have seen light right beside me, but it's not anymore. We live in a very, very, very fast time. And our default then becomes to be a passive listener, like the elephant and the bear and the snake. And our program is to ensure that our default is not to be a passive listener, but rather to be an active listener, because that's the only way that we let go of negativity, that we can feel inspired. Active listening is a precedent to be able to engage in shravana, or listening. Keeping all of this in mind, we are now completing our 8th month of our program. We have 4 more months until we complete our beta year. This is all new to all of the people who are organizing this, all of the people who are participating. And we have 60 matches. That means 60 mentors and 60 mentees. This is a large group of seekers that are coming together for active listening. And we're doing well. And we're fortunate that we have people who care about us enough to share their professional expertise with us. We've been engaging in this professional expertise every other month. And in the in-between months, a very communal gathering. That's all I have to share for now. And we'll shift into our professional workshop. And I'll join all of you at the end. For those who are here for the pre-workshop, you'll know why I'll join you at the end. For those who don't, and you can infer whatever you want. And I'll pause here. Team, you can continue.
Thank you so much, Vivekji. Hariom, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is our fourth formal workshop in the wellness series. We're so fortunate to have presented so many diverse topics in this series, from loneliness to gender identity to perfectionism. Today's topic of social identity, privilege, and allyship will be facilitated by who is both a seeker as well as the members of our Mentorship Advisory Committee. Grew up in Houston, where he started Mission Balvihar in the 3rd grade. He currently works in diversity and inclusion at UC Berkeley's Business School, where he helps incoming students understand diversity, equity, and inclusion fundamentals as they relate to identity, power, and the opportunity to build inclusive systems. Lives in Oakland, California with his partner and puppy, and he's also recently married. So congratulations, And we really appreciate you taking out the time to share your knowledge and expertise with our community. Welcome,
Hariom, Chitale, thank you so much. Hariom, Vivekji. Hariom, everyone. My name is My gender pronouns are he and him. And I'm excited to have this conversation today. It brings together two worlds in a way for me, in a way that this wellness workshop series has always brought together two worlds. It's a world that I grew up with in terms of a really core part of my identity with mission and a conversation on identity, as we've all shared in. And then a conversation that I have in my professional world, but has very much become a part of my core identity as well, around understanding how I move around in this world. And as we are in this world, as we are playing this role, what might be the right way to engage. And so the conversation around social identity is one that's really complicated. And just like every other wellness workshop, we won't come to a conclusion at the end of 45 minutes. But my hope for this conversation is that we all continue to reflect on who we are as it relates to the systems in which we live, right? So whether some of your core values are service or oneness or love, or however you frame how you're trying to move around in the world, one thing that I've tried to continue growing in is understanding that that doesn't happen in a vacuum. We have this world to practice in. And so understanding ourselves and understanding a little bit of the systems and the society that we live in, whatever that is for you, whatever your ecosystem is, it's really critical to understanding that balance and that right engagement with the world. So that's the broader context of this conversation. Quickly and importantly, I consider myself a facilitator in this conversation, and that is a very specific role compared to anything like a teacher, right? A facilitator in this role, as I'm going to play, I'm going to invite you into the conversation often. I'm going to invite you into the conversation to reflect. I don't have all the answers. And I suspect there's lots of you in the audience, in the community right now, who have experience with this, whether it's lived or professional or some combination of the two. So I brought the worksheets, and we all get to do the work together. That's basically what it comes down to. So I have about 10 minutes past the hour here, and the way I want to spend the next 5 minutes, and Ricky, I would love your help with two things as I'm kind of giving the overview here. Ricky, if you could drop the link to 4 worksheets. So it's a Google Drive. Please, everyone, just click into that. We're going to spend some time in all 4 of these worksheets today. You don't have to read them right now, but before we get into those worksheets, as you start opening them, I actually want to get people's voices in the room. And I'm not doing this just flippantly. This is a core principle of running workshops when it comes to kind of big topics like this. It's important to invite people into the conversation. And so that's a little meta analysis of what I'm doing. But if we could actually break people, Ricky, into small breakout rooms here, I know we have about 29 people. So I'm thinking even 2 to 3 people per room. Let's get folks out into the room over the next, I'm going to say, 3 minutes. I'd love for you to introduce yourselves to each other. And as Vivekji kind of framed out around active listening, really pay attention to each other. And one thing you might introduce yourself with is, based on your name, If you are practicing on the journey of understanding your gender pronoun, if you want to put that out there, try that out. Say it out loud, see how it feels, see how it lands, and tell the other person about, or tell the other people what your favorite thing about this weekend has been. So simple topic on purpose, practice active listening with the other person, and in 3 minutes, we'll come back and get going into these worksheets.
Hi, Jagruti ji.
Hariom.
Hari
Sorry, my tardiness.
No worries. We are in a breakout room. So I'm going to quickly share a link. It's a Google Drive with 4 worksheets. You'll need that. And I'm going to assign you a breakout room so that you can join one of the rooms. You won't
Okay.
be doing it. Don't worry.
Thank you.
Let me try and see how I can add you to a breakout room.
Ricky, I think it'd be great to bring folks back right now, actually. So maybe
Okay.
we can just skip was it
Okay.
Jagrati you're trying to go through? It's okay,
Yeah.
we'll catch you up. It was just introductions right now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ricky. Really appreciate you.
No problem. They'll have 60 seconds to come back.
Okay, great. Well, Jagrati, what we were doing was just a quick introduction to get voices in the room. Would you like to just briefly introduce yourself and tell us something cool that happened this weekend?
Sure. My name is Chagrati and I'm in Tampa, Florida. And great thing that happened, my nephew actually turned 11 today.
Congrats. Awesome. It was wonderful to meet. I mean, it's actually just wonderful to look at the screen right now. And I don't think I've really spent time with any of you. I can't see everyone right now, but it's really exciting. All right, I know people are coming back here. Welcome back, everyone. Come on back. As you're already in this room, if you're in this room, go ahead and open the social identity groups worksheet. That's the first one we're going to start with. Identity and privilege, it might be titled. Open that up and just have that as a reference. Okay, I see that the room is basically full. Please come on back and open up the identity and privilege worksheet. It might be called social identity groups. It is called that once you open it. We're gonna spend some time just discussing this. Again, I'm a facilitator here, So I'm going to start the conversation off, but I'm actually really excited to welcome in a couple of perspectives. So if there was actually someone, I won't name them in case they don't want us to talk in the big group, but there was someone in our group who's run conversations like this and workshops like this. So I know there's others who have had this conversation either as participants or just in life in general. So I'd love to hear from the group first. What does social identity mean for you? Why do you think this is an important conversation in this community to be having? Just a quick reflection would be great. And I can't see everyone, so if it's okay with you, just come off mute. We have a small enough group that we can kind of just roll with it.
I think that it could be what makes you the person that you are. So it could be your ethnicity or your religion, or also like the people that you associate with and the things that you like.
Love it. Thanks so much. One more. Anyone want to build on that or provide a different perspective?
For me, it has been what other identities people have placed on me so many times that I'm just not aware that, oh yeah, I'm supposed to be a female, I'm a female. Or it's more like that sometimes.
Thanks for building that in. I think both of you bring really key elements of what social identity is. It is a sense of, on one hand, how we identify ourselves. And it is also a sense of how society or how people around us prescribe or ascribe identity onto us based on social norms. And I think gender is one of the conversations that maybe you've already experienced in some way or the other, this idea of gender expression and gender identity, and how that isn't necessarily something that is going to line up perfectly in terms of how one identifies and how society is going to see you, right? So you can already start seeing the nuance of what social identity can be, and it is across a variety of different characteristics, right? Whether it's ethnicity, whether it's race, there are certain ones that are going to be a little more visible, and there are certain ones that are going to be a little less visible, right? So if you have this worksheet open, as you're going through the different examples that are given on the worksheet, you might start looking at things like social class or ability or nationality, citizenship. There are certain things that you're not going to necessarily look at someone and immediately ascribe something one way or the other, right? But then there might be some in terms of maybe some assumptions you make based on race or gender or ethnicity. We haven't talked about some of the other ones like height, size. All these things are part of the social identity that we have, and it affects the way that both we move through the world and how the world perceives us as we move through it, right? And I think as you've seen the title of this conversation, it's important, especially in this conversation, to understand that social identity as it relates to some of those social norms that we've already been talking about, because it has an impact. In this conversation, we'll do it quickly. We'll start talking about allyship soon, but it has an impact on how you might move through this world and the approach you take in certain environments or in certain systems or at work or whatever it is, in terms of understanding your own access to power, access to privilege because of different parts of your identity, right? So this part's going to feel a little uncomfortable. For a couple of different reasons, I think. One, because it's just hard to think about oneself and talk about yourself. And two, if you're anything like me, I kind of mentioned it in my intro, I am not going to lie, I grew up with this idea of Vedanta and thinking that I needed to push away all parts of my identity, my social identity, who I was in this body or this mind and intellect, because we are not those things, right? Vedantically speaking. And I struggled with this concept for a long time until, at least for myself, what I've realized is I have to go through this world. And so I have to go through this understanding who I am and understanding systems to understand truly that I'm not those things. It's not that I can go around them. That's how I currently understand it and perceive it and walk through it. So I offer that up just in case that's something that you're also thinking about. But I want us to get active here. And by active, I mean either with a piece of paper or with someone's in the room, or if active for you is just thinking, that's cool too. I'm scrolling down here and I'm going down to what I'm seeing is called social identity profile, right? The second page of this worksheet. I want you to fill this out. Not every single cell necessarily. We don't have the time for that right now anyway. And of course you have access to this going forward, but I want you to fill it out. And I want you to really pay attention to the columns and recognize they're there for a reason, right? So group membership, just to give you an example of what I'm talking about, my gender, I identify as male, right? That's my gender. And so I would put that. Things that I'm most aware of in terms of my gender, honestly, I would put not much. And we're going to talk about why that might be in a little bit. It might be the thing I think about least, and we'll talk about why, right? When we come down to something like ethnicity, I identify as South Asian, as Indian, right? And I'm very aware of that. I walk through this world and I notice the fact that I'm different than a lot of people, or same as other people in different situations. I'm acutely aware of it. It's not something I think about the least, right? If you scroll over to the right, you're seeing things like, hey, which of these things have an effect on my decision making? Well, one of the things that I think about is my religion. We're all here perhaps because we share some sense of religion, or at least faith, or upbringing. And when it comes to decision making, that has an effect, right? I'm not the majority. I grew up in Southern Baptist Houston. That's not necessarily the majority down there. And so it has an effect on how I process the world, how I move through the world, things like that. So we're going to stay in this big group, especially because we don't have too many people. But I want to take the next 3 minutes and pick a couple of things on the y-axis, and try to fill them all the way through. And we're going to discuss a little bit of what comes up for you, but we're going to stay in this big group in case you also want to come off mute and ask any questions of each other. But let's go through this together. Let's take 3 minutes, and it's okay if there's silence too. All right, welcome back, everyone. Super easy conversation, right? No anxiety, no nothing about identity, full understanding. So listen, every time I fill out a worksheet like this, don't think that it ever becomes like completely easy. You know, there's always new things that pop up in terms of either understanding myself or understanding the system, and understanding, whoa, that was a blind spot. Like, what's going on over here? So I'd love to get some voices in the room. I really want to hear how that was for you. If you need a more guided question around it, as Ricky dropped in the chat, when you think about which of these social identities perhaps gives you a little bit of power and privilege in society, I'd love to hear about that. One disclaimer I'll make, as either you know or you innately kind of understand, identity is intersectional. You might have heard that term before, right? I'm not asking you to live the world one row at a time, but for the sake of a model, to really dig into the different elements of your identity, I think this is an instructive exercise. So with that said, let me hear from someone we haven't heard from yet. What was interesting to you? What came up for you? Well said, Ricky, in the chat. What was something that struck you as maybe a different column? Let's start with, you think about the least. Did anything come up for anyone in terms of different parts of their identity that you said, well, I don't really think about that? Prakash? Yeah.
Yeah, for me, I went into the social class row, and I was thinking about, okay, I'm upper class, definitely economically. So what that means is I think about very little is whether I have enough money to buy something. Usually it's just, do I really need it? Or am I really going to use it? That kind of thing is the decision calculus. But what came up for me as I was as I was monologuing to my group, is that the power and privilege, initially I thought, this doesn't really give me power and privilege, because there's people way richer, wealthier than I am who seem to, the top 1% or whatever, that have all the power. But it does give me power and privilege in society to spend time on things and activities that are for social good, that people in the lower strata, they just don't have time or resources to maybe get politically engaged, for example.
Thanks for sharing that. That is, I think about that all the time, and I like that word privilege, especially for that, right? It's a privilege to be able to spend time on something you care deeply about, because sometimes that's not the case. And I don't know if it was the case for anyone else, but I think about my parents. Vivekji is actually the one who literally I quote every time when I say this, is that our parents had to work to survive. Perhaps that might resonate for you, while we maybe get to work to thrive because of that, right? And that's an incredible privilege. We're going after self-actualization here because we don't have to, work minimum wage necessarily. I don't. I'll speak for myself, to make ends meet in this moment. incredible privilege. Thanks for sharing that, Prakash. And I think that's a really interesting one to start on, because that's probably mine as well. And it's hard for me to even talk about social class sometimes because I'm like, I don't want to be that, but I am. And it's okay to acknowledge. What else? Sumedha, is that right?
Yeah,
Pronounce it right?
it's Amanda. So I was gonna say like citizenship status, because that not like I don't really think about it that much, but it does give me a lot of power and privilege because obviously, I mean obviously, but I'm a citizen of the United States, and like compared to my parents, they had to like work really hard. They had to like spend years and years just like on a visa and on a green card before they could even. Sorry, that was my brother in the back. Before they can even like take their citizenship test. And I think obviously being a citizen, I am able to vote and because of my birthright citizenship status. And it just gives me so much more privilege, especially when working with like immigration authorities. And I don't really have to go through some of the things that like my relatives have to go through. And like especially with visa problems especially during under like Trump, it was a big thing in our family. So I don't know, I think that gives me a lot of privilege.
It's a deep reflection. Thanks for that. It's so real, right? And if you have it, you don't think about it necessarily until you look around and like, whoa, that's what you had to go through to try to get there. And that's deep. I love one more. Pooja, please.
One that stands out to me is disability. Like I think being able-bodied, I've never really thought about that privilege that I have. And I was telling my group, like the 2 small times I've noticed how much society is like physically laid out for able-bodied people. And I'm just talking about physical kind of abilities is like when I've had crutches or when I've had a stroller and I'm getting around, like it feels so much more impossible to get upstairs and open doors. And I just think of like people who aren't, able-bodied, how difficult it is just to like navigate really basic tasks. So that's one that I like completely have never really paid attention to until more recently.
Thank you for sharing that. I mean, I know there's going to be more reflections, but one thing that I'm hearing, as I listen to these 3 wonderful reflections is this has always been the case, but thinking about the last year and a half, those 3 examples that were just brought up, right? Social class, access to income, citizenship, ability / health privilege. These things that are so stark all around us right now. And I know that might be something that you've been thinking about over the last year and a half. And you might think about across varying identities, varying groups of people who have access to power, who have access to privilege. And maybe for some of you, as you're thinking about some of the columns where you acknowledge and you recognize, this gives me access to power. How do I feel about that? One, that's something you should definitely sit with, and it may not feel totally great, but sit with it, think about it. And 2, as we transition into another conversation here, if you're opening on that Google Doc or on that Google folder, you'll see the other 3 pages in there are all about allyship, right? And I think it's important to bring the conversation to allyship here in the last 10, 12 minutes here, because once we start understanding our own identity, once we start recognizing that, whoa, that identity gives me some level of access to power and to privilege, then maybe the question becomes, what do we do with that? What do we do about it? How do we want to live in this world? How do we want to wield that power? Right? Classic Spider-Man stuff, great power, great responsibility. Or was that Batman? I don't know, one of the superheroes. But it's probably relevant to you right now. You're looking around saying like, I do have access to that, right? Prakash said it. We may not think about it as much, but when you really dig into it, you say, whoa, I have the privilege to do X, Y, Z. And so please open up the characteristics of an ally worksheet. We'll go there, and then we'll briefly spend some time on the Ally Continuum worksheet. I will say that the Ally Action Planning worksheet, we're not going to actually talk about today. That's just something, if you want to continue reflecting on this, and you're an active thinker and you want to write stuff down, that's an opportunity for you to move forward with this conversation after. So open up the characteristics of an ally worksheet and just note the top. What is an ally? There's a couple of key components here, right? An ally is a member of the advantaged social group. We just spent some time talking about it, who takes a stand. It's an active concept. And you may have seen this in maybe social media or wherever else, right? Allyship is not a noun, it's a verb. So it's this idea of taking a stand against social injustice directed at targeted groups. There's some examples right there, right? So it's an active concept. It requires you to understand the advantage you might have in a particular scenario or a particular identity. And it it begs this question that to be an ally is to be an agent of social change instead of an agent of oppression. And that's a deep sentence. So just to kind of dig one layer deeper on that, the idea here is that if you are coming from a disadvantaged perspective, or if you look at this worksheet and you notice the different places where you're not the dominant community, recognizing that the systems that are set up, kind of Pooja mentioned this, right? It's a little bit more visible for us if we're walking around, for example, compared to if you're not walking. Or in other scenarios, if you're a parent and you have a stroller, etc., you recognize that there are certain ways things are built, and it's not for people who necessarily are wheeled in that way, right? So it requires you to understand that there's all this happening all around us. You can call it oppression. That's one way to think about it. You can call it disadvantage. Find the word that lets you move forward in it. And you work to be an agent against that. It's a really powerful concept. It is not surface level stuff. It is deep. It requires so much introspection and so much constant understanding of what we can do in this world. It's an incredible privilege in itself, I think, to practice allyship. So you can think about the characteristics of an ally. You have this worksheet. You can look at it, certainly reflect on it. But for 2 minutes, what I want to do together here, we're not going to break out into groups. I actually want to open up the ally continuum worksheet to close out this piece of the conversation. That's another page in that Google Drive. And you'll see that allyship, as we've talked about, it's active, it's continuous. And one other thing here to say is it's on a spectrum, right? It's a continuous concept of understanding oneself, understanding the system, and moving through this spectrum. And you can be an ally across a variety of different identities, and you can be at different parts of the spectrum, right? So on one hand, on the left side here, as I'm looking at actions against inclusion and social justice, actively participating in the oppression, actively participating in the disadvantaging of a community of people. As you can imagine, that's one end of the spectrum. I don't think that would quite land on the allyship spectrum, but it's just there as a model. On the other hand, you are actively initiating, preventing. It's a super active concept. And maybe for some of us, certainly for me, a lot of times I'm sitting in kind of the recognizing no action, like, how does that feel? Or educating myself, right? A lot of conversation about let's read more books, let's understand. But see how many things are to the right of educating oneself, and really think about what that means in terms of your own allyship journeys. I'm certainly doing the same here. All right, so we're going to take 2-3 minutes here. We want to make sure we get back to Vivekji in 3 minutes tops. But I'm seeing a lot of nodding. I'm going to open up the chat, so apologies if I missed something I was supposed to have woven in. But I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you're one of the chatters, if you want to bring it in and start a conversation, please do so. Divya, I think your comment's really deep, understanding that my mind is not always in the best place to even recognize some of those things. I hear you.
I think for me, one of the biggest takeaways was these are not questions, like these are all questions that have been asked in some way or another for me, like either at like an employment form or like something along those lines, but never have I taken the time to like actually take that to myself and kind of see myself and try to visualize my social identity through. I've just kind of circled some boxes or whatever, checked some boxes and kind of called it a day. I think the biggest thing that stuck out to me too was how much there's a relativity component to it, that I'm more aware of certain aspects of my social identity depending on the context that I'm in. Whether I'm in my professional work setting, there's certain things that I'm more aware of versus if I'm out and about, in town doing whatever. I think there's other things that I'm more aware of just depending on the social context. And I think taking a step back to kind of just bring that awareness to the social identity piece of it was super interesting and helpful. And I think that'll be something that I sit with for a long time.
Thanks for that, Krishna. That relativity piece definitely lands for me, right? I grew up in Mission. So on Sundays, I was not the minority. On every other day, I was the minority. Right there's some relativity in my life that I just kind of formed how I think about things. And in Mission, I never really thought about the fact that I identify as a man and what privilege that gives me the rest of my life in a system that we have right now, where that gives me access to power. It's deep and it's so layered. And you're right about the checking the boxes. I have a view on that. It's like that's what the system's designed to do, is to not let you really dig deep into it. It's to keep us busy and to not really step back and reflect. So I'm just really grateful that everyone's here stepping back and reflecting. Cyrus, thanks for sharing that. It's powerful. In the chat, for those of you who can see the chat. So Vivekji has offered that we can keep this conversation going for 4 to 5 more minutes. So don't feel like you have to end your thought within a minute here. But anyone else want to build on what Krishna was saying, or bring in a new perspective or a question?
I'm having this struggling thought that identities feel so much only about differences. And then when I had an opportunity for about 2.5 years to live in a totally different culture that I was not used to, then the differences were so strong for me to be ally of anything seemed so out of reach, because it just speaks so many different identities so many people have. How can I actually be ally for all those aspects of lives that I don't even understand? So it just feels very focused on differences, and it feels wrong to think that way.
That's powerful. Thanks for sharing that. If I could just build on that last piece, this idea of it feels wrong to focus on those differences. I don't have the answer. I'm just agreeing with you. That's what I was sharing earlier, that it felt like digging into this work meant that I was dissociating from the concept of oneness, and that I shouldn't be focused on that I should be focused on what unifies us, etc. And I don't have an answer. I'm still working through it. Would love anyone's perspective on this as we go forward. But again, the way I've landed on it for now in my life is I wear this hat in this world. There are differences. To ignore the differences is to ignore those systems of power that are privileging certain groups over the others. And it's a great opportunity to serve. It's not mindless service, it's mindful service to understand where I can help, because where I have access to that power and privilege might be the space that I can turn around and make sure that others have it too. And if I don't do this analysis of really understanding who I am and who the system is, I might be a little bit, less careful. That's where I stand right now. That's something I can offer that we can all reflect on. Jenny?
Yeah, I think kind of going off of that for a very long time. So I'm in the medical field, and I just was waiting throughout my education to finally help people. And then I had an aha moment when I started to help people, that I was focusing so much on the body and the mind. And that was the levels in which that most of my day functioned, and just working at the biomolecular levels. I'm this is not Vedantic, it's a very identity focused approach. But then I think as I was zooming out, I was realizing that as I dealt with the different layers of someone's identity, that intersectionality, I was able to help them figure out what is that joy inside of them, how do we get to the big goal, which is them being able to do what they want with their day, with their life. And so my small stepping stone that I'm offering is a little bit better physical health or mental health. And so I think that has helped me kind of be a little bit more comfortable with focusing at one layer at a time, especially in terms of identity too. I mean, I identify as straight, but as an ally to the LGBTQ community, I can use my privilege to say hey, I see you. I have a teenager in my office. Do you like boys or girls or both? Who do you like to date? And just making that normal makes them feel, okay, this is an accepted part of my medical health. And so then I could focus on the other things and explain everything else to my doctor too openly.
Thanks for that. Thanks for the reflection and the example. I hope that lands for everyone. That totally lands for me, because it reminds me that maybe we need to speak the unspoken. The idea of having access to that privilege and power is that we can be the ones who open that door, instead of relying on people who have been repeatedly exposed to some kind of harm to have to open a door. And when I say open a door, I mean identify in terms of their sexual orientation, identify in terms of other elements of their identity. Because it may not, right, I'm not speaking for Jenny, but in my case, it's I can say the word partner when I introduce myself, and I say, I have a partner. Do you have a partner? Versus saying, do you have a girlfriend? Because I see a guy in front of me and I'm assuming that they're straight. I will never forget a moment in my life where one of my classmates looked at me when I offered that as my intro, and he said, this is the first time I've been asked that in that way. I didn't have to rip open the Band-Aid like I have to do every single time someone asks me if I have a girlfriend. game changer, right? I'm never gonna like assume someone's orientation again, because I recognize that access that I had, it didn't cost me anything to ask if the person had a partner. But that's the power of being an ally and understanding your privileges. So I think this is a good place to pause. I'm going to be around after the top of the hour so we can keep the conversation going. But thank you all for just being with me through this, and you have access to these worksheets. So feel free to keep working through it, and we can stay in touch and keep talking about them. And I'll pass it to Vivekji. Hariom.
Right on, Om. A lot of what you've been sharing for the last 45 minutes reminds me of a sutra that Pujya Swami Tejo Mayananda shares in Tips for Happy Living, that everyone is you, but you shouldn't expect everyone to be like you. And that's a fine balance of fundamentally there is oneness, but functionally there are differences. And our problem is that we make differences superior and inferior instead of just allowing those differences to be differences, right? I am going to speak for a few minutes about a special project. After that, our mentorship team will share some announcements about what's happening in the coming months. And then, as Om shared, at 10 o'clock, we'll continue with our dialogue. I'm sure everyone has many more reflections to share and questions to ask of Om, and he's trained in this field. A lot of us don't have the orientation or the terminology, and Om can help us with that. I will finish with our prayer, and please continue with this awesome dialogue that's going to happen with Om. I'm actually meeting with the CM Orlando group to plan our spiritual parenting workshop. And that will be very relatable to so many who are joining us right now. So as soon as those details are finalized, we'll share those with you too. Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Be safe, be sound, be serene. Shri Krishna Chandra Bhagavan ki Jai. Be happiness. Om, thank you again. Please continue.
Hariom Vivekji, thank you. So let's have a Q&A. I want to acknowledge a couple of really deep comments put in this chat earlier on. And if the people who wrote them will want to kind of explain so we can all learn from you, that'd be amazing. But Isha, you're talking about Dharma as empathy and what that means for acknowledgement of identity. I think that's a really deep comment, and I could use some clarification. So if you could consider sharing a little more what you mean there. And then Sumedha, you're talking about allyship as equity, right? Bringing others along in whatever conversation we're having. Those are just two of the really deep things that I'm seeing here, and I would love to hear where those are coming from, if you would be willing to share a little more.
Sure. I'm sorry. I've been on mute in a little bit because I have a very active cat that's causing trouble here. Some of you may have seen her pop up and on the video screen. So I'll say also that thought is not original at all. I got it from I do a decent amount of like progressive liberation theology, like reading on Hinduism, and I've gotten that from Devat Patnaik, for those of you who are familiar with his work, which is kind of a more progressive stance on Hinduism. You can hear her attacking a bird, I'm sorry, like a toy bird in the background. So he was the first one who wrote that, and I remember thinking that, you know, the traditional Sanskrit interpretation of dharma is as duty, but the idea of dharma as being instead a way of relating to others, like it's still a way of relating to others, but rather than it being rule bound, being feeling bound, was a really powerful idea to me. And it being instead of something imposed by others or by a system, social class, for example, something that we impose within ourselves as an exercise of compassion and kindness towards others. Thank you all for forgiveness of me for this cat that's trying to have dharma for the cat.
Just so you know, it's not that distracting. We can barely hear anything in the background. So I really appreciate the thought there, though. It's a beautiful concept of feeling versus a duty necessarily in an action. Sumedha, are you still here? Would you care to talk through?
Yeah, I'm still here. let me just like recollect my thoughts real quick. So okay, so we were talking about like oneness and how like seeing differences is kind of like we don't want to see differences. We want to see everybody as like equal. Like we're all made up of God and all of that. So I think that by equity over equality, because obviously we want to bring people up that are disadvantaged, not just like give everybody like the same thing, because we're not all the same. Like especially like in this flawed world that we have, we're not all the same. So by allyship, we're we're helping other people, and one that's like being a good human being, and by bringing other people up we can cultivate that kind of connection that we don't have when we just see like stark differences. And by acknowledging that we are different and that we do have different problems that we face, but we can like face them together by helping others, I think that really shows like oneness, and that everybody does have God within them, and that we have to make sure that we recognize that even though we do face different challenges because we are different people.
Yeah, that makes I mean, it makes a lot more sense now that I hear you kind of talk through it. Thank you so much for that. I totally agree. And you know, equity is a word that maybe folks have heard or seen, and let's keep thinking about what equity might mean, right? This idea of differentiated resources, differentiated investment, differentiated input for perhaps an equitable outcome. It's a really deep concept. I think these words get thrown around a lot, especially in my world. And so it's always a good idea to step back and reflect on what diversity means, what equity means, what access and inclusion mean, things like that. So thanks for that reminder too. Why don't we open up into a Q&A as well? Of course, open to your reflections too. I'll do my best to share based on my work and training if I can help. And I appreciate all the wonderful insights and notes here on chat. So you can do it through there too. I'll keep an eye on both. Anyone have questions?
Hariom, can I just actually make a comment? The fact that we're all here talking about topics that are making us uncomfortable is allowing our own transformative process to be more accepting. A lot of the groups, you know, as I've heard conversations and tried to think and listen to what they're saying, they just haven't felt accepted by society, and that has led to them, you know, hiding. You know, and just, you know, has led to depression and anxiety because they don't feel anybody's listening or accepting them. So I think us, you know, for this discussion, even just talking about these types of things is really important, because we all look at things that we may not have thought of, right? And Om, thank you for the conversation, because us transforming allows the individuals that we reach at work or in society to be more accepting, and that if they see that helps with the process. And some of the things that the challenges I feel are, I've got family members that, you know, traditionally raised in India, born and raised, how they haven't come to that, like what we're talking about now, and they have their biases. If you're getting together with a family, you hear these biases, right? And you try to say, you shouldn't look at it that way, or you shouldn't think about another group that way. But they haven't come that far. So you know, so there's challenges there in dealing with family members that are still entrenched in, I want to say, old thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing. Ricky, do you have a reflection on that comment? Okay, so let's stick on that just for a moment, and we'll come to you. I think that's a powerful conversation. What I think of when I hear you, Kalpesh, is that, I mean, just for the sake of this topic, like what privilege has led me to be in this space at this time, able to have this conversation. You know, we talked a little bit earlier, Prakash was mentioning how there's a little bit of like, we have the privilege to be able to serve, or the privilege to be able to do the things we care about, this being one of them. I'm in a home right now. I have a home, and that privilege is so kind of one of those columns that I don't think about often. I saw a really cool meme recently, this idea of work from home. We've been maybe complaining about it, talking about it for so long, but it's like work from home means I have work and I have a home. Like, incredible privilege to have both of those things and to be able to do that. So really appreciate that. And then, you know, let's sit with this idea of our family and of our community and of the things that we might think of when we think about our family and community. Because I suspect that we all have a version of that comment right? Like people in our community or family who we look at and we're like, ah, God, why can't you be XYZ? But I know, Vivek, you always mentioned this, right? Like I'd rather start with me. I got a lot to work on. And so I'm going to keep trying to unearth the things that I need to work on before I start looking around. That's a very elevated version of how I actually live. I'm with you. I get frustrated real fast, but that's at least my goal. But I'm with you on that. And you have us, right? That's a beautiful thing too. We have each other. So that's a really good unearth. Ricky, what's up?
I remember how to spotlight myself. The question I have, and I just want to give this scenario that happened yesterday, and it's being on my mind. There are a group of families with kids, and I'm a dad now, so I'm very conscious of how parents interact with each other. So here's this 11-year-old who is sharing that he was talking to his class about favorite cars. And contrary to all of his other friends, he shared that his favorite car is Honda Odyssey, a minivan. So all of a sudden, his friends started laughing, and the parents' reaction and some of the other parents there was that you shouldn't have done that. You should have just said your favorite car is BMW or Tesla or whatever. Don't share, that you like Odyssey. And to me, that raised a deeper question, like how much do parents tend to force their kids to hide what they even like, forget their identity, right? Like it's trying to create a stereotype that as a boy, you should be liking this car and share that with the world. And so my question actually is this: at a more deeper level, how do you address those parents when you see something like that happening, where they're trying to confront their kid to be one way or the other? How do you have the conversation?
Any other parents here who want to weigh in?
I mean, as a parent, I would say if a child likes a Honda Odyssey, that's what they like. I mean, who am I to impose what I like on my child? I mean, I agree with you, Ricky, that as parents, if we impose our thoughts and feelings, you're taking away a child's ability to think for themselves, appreciate life from their lens. So I totally agree with you. As parents, we may have in the past done too much of that, and we shouldn't be. We should let the children, how they feel and what they like is what they like.
Supriya, Madhav, anything on that? Yeah, Supriya, you want to go then, please?
What's interesting is that I feel like a lot of us have experienced this if our parents came to North America and to help us fit in, right? Their intention was to help us fit in. Like, it's okay, like, say that you like spaghetti and like try to fit in and do this and that activity just so you can fit in. The intention isn't to cover up what you actually like and who you are, but is almost like survival mode. So I think a lot of us have been influenced by that, but I don't think they had meant it to like for us to actually hide, but that was kind of what we ended up doing sometimes. We did have to hide what we ate, at home and at school. We did have to hide about like what we did on holidays or how much we actually did or did not celebrate Christmas or whatever. So that I feel like a lot of us did experience a different version of that.
Yeah.
Another thought. Oh, sorry. I was just thinking another thought that comes to mind. I'm not a parent at all, so I am making this up as a non-parent. But I'm in the mental health field, and we talk quite a bit about the inherent privilege that all parents have over their child, the amount of power that they have. I think we take that for granted. We've all been children. We all kind of recall sort of what that experience was like, but it's hard to remember when you're actually in that position of power. We don't think of it as privilege, I think, in a traditional sense. But in mental health, when we talk about like child psychiatry, we absolutely acknowledge that children are imposed upon in terms of values by their parents and by generational values and generational trauma too. And I think of the many ways in which that comes up in Hindu mythology. Like the classic example I think of is like Prahlad. who is this, there's so many precocious children in the Hindu mythologies, and their parents are imposing these things on them, and they shine in their just like raw enthusiasm for Bhagwan, and their passion and their bhakti for Bhagwan, and that's what actually guides the next generation. And so it reminds me of the power of the child in some ways, and how much that's like captured in our mythology. It's so rich.
Yeah, thanks for that reflection. That's something that I'm thinking about too. This idea that in our culture, perhaps just to kind of paint a broader brush for a second, the obedience for parents and love for parents, and how that shows up in terms of kind of subsuming our own identity for the sake of what they want, and how that can manifest later in life, perhaps. It's really deep, right? And I don't have the answer for that situation, so I appreciate others kind of jumping in on that. But I think for all of us, regardless of our kind of identity in terms of parents, it's like there are generations coming up all the time. We have impact on the next generation. No matter if you think you don't, you do, right? Based on how you act in society, the way you stand up for others, the allowances you make for kids to be themselves. It's not the same example, but it's a similar example. You know, I have nephews and nieces, and kind of like non-related nephews and nieces and whatnot, and I'm really careful about what language I use when I ask them about what's going on at school, right? And I'm forgetting who brought this up last time, but it was that conversation of like, oh, who are you interested in? What are you interested in? Is it the gendered conversation around Barbies, as I see in the comment here, versus cars or whatever else it might be? Keep things open-ended and allow for some of that precociousness. I like that word to come out. I think that's really powerful because we have that influence, right? Even at Mission, especially if you see other situations happening where people are kind of stacking kids up into neat little rows. And I do appreciate the empathy that comes in thinking about why that parents might be doing it. But what responsibility might we have as a generation or as a group of people who want to be more open, who want to be more inclusive and accepting in terms of the language we use, in terms of the questions that we ask, in terms of how we talk about ourselves, and don't pigeonhole ourselves into particular spaces. Madhav, you've had your hand up for a while. I'd love to hear your thought or your question.
So I have my initial question was would be a little bit of a veering from this conversation, but I do have a thought on this conversation. So like this idea of fitting in, it's making me really think about how like I think the conditioning is really deep here, especially within the Indian mindset, that like colonialism and fitting in has been, you know, like if you didn't fit in, if you talked back, if you didn't act in the way that the, you know, people in power wanted you to act, then, you know, it could result in death. So it almost became like a survival mechanism. And I just feel like, I can't help but feel like that's had to have been passed down over the generations, like a really deep conditioning within the Indian mindset. And I'm sure through like so many other cultures too, who have undergone colonization, there's this deep feeling that, you know, we have to serve those people in power in order for us to, you know, survive. And it's beautiful in a way because they needed to do it to survive. But now when that power discrepancy isn't so great, I feel like there's still sometimes this feeling of adapting and fitting in when we don't have to as much. And we need to push back a little bit more.
I think that's a trip of a conversation. Like you said, it's important and it's so deep, because what it really begs the question of is like, where are we getting our tendencies as a community, as a group of people? Perhaps is it, especially in this group, it's like I like to think that a lot of what we really deeply believe in is coming from our most ancient of scriptures, and we're living by that. But it's like obedience, and like, is that coming from that, or is that coming from this idea of, for, you know, several hundred years we had an empire in our land in that way? Or one that my partner and I are talking a lot about, and this is a real trip for me because it feels like a really good thing, but it's this idea of exceptionalism. Where is exceptionalism coming from? It sounds like pretty surface level, like, yeah, you should try your best, you should absolutely work as hard as you can and go like rise as much as you can. But if the system that our ancestors have kind of grown up in, recent ancestors especially, is that you had to be exceptional to have access to anything, and that's ingrained in us as a concept. And then as immigrants, we've come over here and that's come up with us. I'll put that out there without an ask for a reflection on purpose, just so we can all kind of sit with something like that, because it blew my mind when I first started thinking about it. Right. And again, it's this idea of stepping back and understanding, like, why am I the way I am? And why is society the way society is? And I love that we're bringing in, I think by almost definition for us, in terms of maybe our identity or at least our spirituality, a global understanding of this, right? A lot of times this conversation in corporations, for example, is based on a country or a region or whatever else it might be. And that's okay, because you have to have some frame to start on. But this is super complex. Identity is complex and systems of power are complex. And the way they trace their way through and the way those two things are connected, it's really, really deep. And I guess the opportunity then becomes to act in our own independence, as Vivek would say, in our own happiness. That becomes if it wasn't already the goal, it's like, okay, now I can recommit to that goal for all kinds of reasons, because this is critical stuff. Well, shout out to Madhav, by the way. He's one of my brother's favorite people, and I have known him for so long. It's so good to see you here, Madhav.
You too, man.
Also, if y'all know my brother, he's having a baby tomorrow, so I'm putting that out there. Yes, go ahead, Madhav. Yeah, and then we'll go to Prakash after that.
Well, early congrats that you're gonna be an uncle, man. So I'm taking a look at this characteristics of an ally sheet. And for some reason, not for some reason, but like number 7, I just keep getting fixated on like takes care of self to avoid burnout. And it just makes me think about how like this process of being an ally and engaging in activism of sorts can be a really difficult process. So I guess I just wanted to get your thoughts on like how to stay like energized and focused amongst, you know, the resistance that comes with engaging in these processes and staying motivated and maintaining that self-care.
Real quick show of hands. For whom does that resonate? This idea of burning out because you felt like you were fighting the good fight or fighting as an ally for a long time, and it felt like a fight. So Madhav, part of it for me is this, and this is a deeply personal question, right? Because you have to know your own kind of approaches to this. As long as you sit with number 7 and then really let it sink in that that is a part of allyship, that is not a thing that sits over there and my allyship is over here. That is a part of long-term sustainable allyship, of long-term sustainable work, right? So if you look at the action continuum worksheet, one thing that your comment makes me think of is as we go to the right and we get into educating others, supporting, encouraging, initiating, preventing, the further right you go, the harder it gets, because the closer you're getting to those systems of power, and power looks around and says, oh, who's coming close? Let me knock them down a little bit, right? Or who are these allies who are stepping up? Like they had access to power. I'm going to try to take that away now, and I'm going to make their life a little bit harder because they're coming a little too close. This is part of the equation. And therefore, I think avoiding burnout by taking care of oneself is a part of the necessary equation. Every scholar, I think, like at some point in their lives, and I've heard a few references already to these scholars, so I'll just kind of keep it broad at that point, talks about this idea that in the long run, the work becomes about educating others, supporting, encouraging, building a base, building a coalition. And at that point, it is so tiring. It is so exhausting, if it isn't already, by the time you're educating yourself. Which, by the way, educating yourself is exhausting. It's tiring. You're coming up against these layers of who you thought you were and how you lived in the world. And now you're getting stripped away and saying, I'm not that. Right? Like I've broken down many times in the last 7 years of my life, like broken down emotionally, because I was just like, this is too heavy, you know, this is just, everything's just too heavy. And one thing I've done for myself is I've actually stepped a little bit back from the front lines, if you will, because I'd rather play the long game. I want to do this work for the rest of my life. And I couldn't do it at that high burn, at least not at this point in my life. So one way I took care of myself was stepping back. And that was really scary. And maybe it's not the right thing. Who knows? I'll learn that as I go. But all I can say is that number 7 is absolutely worthy of being on that list.
Thanks, Om.
I saw another hand earlier if they're still here. Otherwise, we can keep going. I have about 7 minutes left, if that's okay. I do have to go here, but thanks for sticking with me. Cyrus, hi.
Hey, well, I want to just say it's really helpful just being in a group like this. So I'm a little older than most of the folks here, and I kind of wish when I was in my 20s and 30s that there were other folks that I could have connected with. But it's real nice to have friendly faces and thoughts here now. So thank you for the work you're doing, and thanks everybody else for being here. It does help.
Sorry, I couldn't get off mute fast enough. Thank you for sharing that. I don't know if this is where you're going, but one thing that I think all of us can think about is, like, why wasn't this part of our conversation somewhere along the way? No matter what age we are, no matter when we got into it, right? And perhaps going back to Ricky, your question, one of the things we think about as the next generation comes up, as others come up around us, in fact, forget age, just kind of what stage and journey people are in. How do we bring folks in if it feels so good for Cyrus, if it feels so good for me to be in a community like this, asking the questions and reflecting and growing together, right? What spaces do we create right here in our homes or in our communities or at mission or wherever we are, to be able to bring this very real conversation in? I'll admit it might be the same for you. It was really hard to have a really deep Vedantic spiritual conversation without really understanding some of this core context stuff, because I was still breaking down, right? Like I said, I was still kind of like emotionally exhausted, and I kept on trying to latch on to something that I didn't quite understand fully, right? Obviously, that's why I didn't fully understand and integrate it. But I think it's really helpful to be able to speak to this stuff and feel like, yeah, that's part of this journey too. We're in this world. What was, does anyone remember Vivekji's direct quote? Was it, fundamentally we're the same, but functionally we're different? That's going to stick with me. That's such a beautiful way to just put that and then acknowledge that, instead of being like, there's no differences. There's no one, like, we're all the same. So let's just focus in on that. I love Isha's comment here too. I just want to shout that out. This idea of being rather than doing, less exhausting, more true to sense of self. I think it's fair, because doing will feel like you have to have this much done before you can feel good about the fact that you did that much in your allyship. But being allows you to pace differently, among other things it allows you to do. All right, maybe one more question or comment or anything like that. My dog just licked my toes. That's always fun.
I was trying to figure out in my brain, where does consumerism fit in? Like, that's such a big part of most of our identities, and it's not sure if I've explored that side of me.
So it's a big question. That's the only reason I'm kind of chuckling. My initial instinct is to say it fits in everywhere. It's that they're very tied together. This idea that we never have enough, the idea that we have already tied our happiness to having more things versus the sense of being in harmony with each other, right? Like our system is set up for us to look one way so that we ignore. I mean, this is a deep question. This is one thing I'm thinking of. It's set up for us to think this way and ignore everything else. So the more wealth we gain, the more we can buy, the more happy we are, right? Which we've had this conversation in the Vedantic context before about how that's not necessarily the path, but at least what it did for me was it allowed me to ignore injustice in deeper ways in my life. And it allows me to ignore injustice. Couple of examples. One, there's this phrase kind of in power coalition building that the louder we yell on the streets, the higher up to build those buildings, so that they can go further and further up and get the top floor on the top building, pay the most for it, so they don't have to really think about what's going on the streets, right? Another, like a more life example for me, was the career path I chose before I had the privilege of stepping back and deciding this path instead. Like that, the path I used to be on was in consulting, and I was going after it, and it wasn't directly tied to consumerism, but at the end of the day, it was like, make more money so I can have more cool things, and or at least in an empathetic way, have stability in the name of consumerism, etc., and build that up. And I wasn't finding my deeper joy there. And so when I was allowed to step back and look around and say, oh, okay, so it may not be down that path, I thought that was a really powerful thing. That's one offer. Anyone else want to jump in on that one?
I mean, at the root of consumerism, I think, is the idea of valuing objects over people in general and dehumanizing. That to me feels like the core. And so I think there are so many ways in which systems and institutions promote that dehumanization. And I think we all kind of feel it when it happens. To some extent, and so sometimes I don't think I have an easy answer, but sometimes I just kind of sense into that and ask myself, like, am I noticing over time that I'm focusing more on, and not just an object in like a traditional held object kind of way, but maybe it's a psychological object, right? Like maybe it's my psychological safety or my psychological security or whatever. Something that can be held, like something when I also think of being held onto out of fear, right? Like tied to fear. And these are all, it's a huge question and a huge, like, but yeah, just some thoughts.
All right, y'all. Well, this was special. Like I mentioned at the beginning, but to be able to bring this conversation into this space with my mission people, it's something that I've been really excited for with these wellness workshops and with the team who's running it, Vivekji, kind of blessing this process and this conversation. It means a lot to me, and I appreciate everyone kind of sticking through it. Accept non-closure. That is one of the norms that we often start with in this work. It's one of the top 5 norms you're going to see out there. You're not going to find closure in this conversation, and that's okay. Accept that. Sit with it. We'll continue on it. Isha's advice about being versus doing, I think, comes into play here. Just be with it, and maybe we'll continue this conversation. But Hari Om, and thank you all for the opportunity to be a part of this conversation.